Paris in the 1920s was a city alive with contradictions, where quiet recovery from war blended with a restless desire for new sensations. To imagine it is to see a place caught between past and future, where ancient stone streets met modern jazz rhythms, where the memory of sorrow mingled with the spark of reinvention. For those who walked its boulevards, lingered in its cafés, or drifted along its riverbanks, Paris offered both comfort and escape, both familiarity and the promise of something unknown. The war had ended just a few years before, and though its devastation had touched every family, there was also a determination to move forward, to find joy again, to embrace life in all its possibilities. The wounds were still there, empty chairs at dinner tables, photographs on mantels, silence where laughter once was, but alongside them bloomed a resilience. People returned to their work, their crafts, their art, their conversations. The city itself seemed to exhale, to breathe again, to lift its face toward the future. Streets bustled with vendors and carriages, while electric lights flickered into the night, spreading soft glows along broad boulevards and narrow lanes. In markets, the colors of produce glowed against wooden stalls: apples, carrots, leeks, and pears, their skins reflecting early morning sun. Butchers displayed cuts of meat, their counters shining clean under practiced hands. Flower sellers carried bundles of blooms wrapped in paper, filling the air with scents of roses and lilies. All around, life carried on, steady, deliberate, with a rhythm that comforted even as it shifted into something new. The cafés, always the heart of Paris, became gathering places of renewed importance. They were stages and sanctuaries, where writers bent over notebooks, where painters sketched on scraps of paper, where musicians rested between performances. The sound of cups clinking, of spoons stirring, of pens scratching across paper filled the air like a quiet orchestra. Conversations lingered, unhurried, stretching across hours as smoke curled upward from cigarettes and pipes. There was no rush here, only the slow unfolding of thought, of art, of companionship. But in the evenings, the city softened. Lamplight fell across cobblestones, creating patterns of shadow and glow. The Seine reflected bridges and buildings in ripples that shimmered gently, as if the water itself was breathing. Lovers strolled along the riverbanks, their footsteps unhurried, their voices low. A faint sound of music might drift from a passing boat, the notes blending with the night air, carrying into the distance like a lullaby. The world beyond Paris saw this as a place of freedom, and so it drew people in. Writers from America, painters from Spain, musicians from Africa and the Caribbean, thinkers from across Europe. They came seeking inspiration, connection, and escape. The city welcomed them with its mixture of elegance and looseness, tradition and invention. In Montparnasse, artists painted in small studios lit by skylights, while in Montmartre, musicians filled smoky clubs with new rhythms. Paris was a crossroads, a meeting place of cultures and ideas, where every corner seemed to offer another voice, another story, another dream. Jazz arrived like a new language, full of syncopation and improvisation. The sound of trumpets, saxophones, and pianos filled clubs late into the night. People crowded into small rooms where the air was thick with smoke, their bodies swaying gently, their faces lit by candlelight. Some danced, their feet tapping, skirts twirling, shoes scuffing against wooden floors. Others simply listened, letting the music wash over them, feeling its pulse slow their breath, loosen their thoughts. Jazz was more than music. It was a mood, an atmosphere, a way of letting go. And into this atmosphere slipped heroin, quietly, almost invisibly. It was not introduced as a menace, nor as something forbidden, but as something ordinary, even respectable. Pharmacists had sold it as medicine, a remedy for coughs, for pain, for nerves. Doctors had prescribed it in small doses, believing it safer than other options. Its name carried no fear, only a soft promise of relief. But when it found its way into the cafés and clubs, into the rooms where artists and dreamers gathered, it became something different. Heroin did not announce itself with fanfare. It was not the subject of scandal in its early years, nor did it draw attention. Instead, it drifted in like smoke, subtle, quiet, almost unnoticed. Someone would bring it to a gathering, passing it as casually as a cigarette. A vial might rest on a table alongside wineglasses and notebooks. A line might be drawn, a dose shared, the ritual unhurried, as ordinary as pouring another drink. The effect was not loud but soft, a slowing, a smoothing, a sense of drifting away from heaviness into a place where breath and thought moved like water. Paris itself seemed to invite this kind of drifting. Its streets curved and wound like rivers, leading not in straight lines but in meanders, each turn revealing something unexpected: a small courtyard, a hidden garden, a quiet square with a fountain trickling gently. To walk in Paris was to wander, not to hurry, and Heroin, with its slow dissolving of time, matched the city's rhythm. It was not about speed or frenzy, but about pause, about suspension, about floating in a gentle in-between. Picture, for a moment, a café in Montmartre on a winter night. The door creaks open, and a wave of warm air escapes, carrying with it the scent of coffee, tobacco, and damp wool. Inside, tables are crowded, coats hung over chairs, candles flickering in glass holders. At one corner, a group of musicians tune their instruments, the sound of strings and keys blending into the chatter of voices. At another table, two poets lean close, arguing softly, their hands gesturing as they speak. And in a quieter corner still, a painter leans back, eyes half closed, a glass of red wine untouched before him, his thoughts drifting far from the room. On the table beside him, a small packet rests unnoticed by most, part of the scenery, as ordinary as the ashtray or the matches. The heroin craze of Paris was not marked by spectacle but by subtlety. It wove itself into lives quietly, becoming part of evenings, part of conversations, part of the private hours when the city hushed. For many, it was not about escape from reality, but about softening reality, making it bearable, smoothing its edges so that life could be carried more easily. After a war that had torn reality apart, who would not be tempted by something that promised gentleness, stillness, relief? Yet heroin was not the only substance in circulation. Absinthe had long been the drink of poets and painters, its green hue shimmering in glasses, its ritual of sugar and water making each sip a performance. Wine flowed as steadily as the Seine itself, red and white poured into glasses across cafés and bistros. Cigarettes and cigars created their own haze, filling rooms with curls of grey smoke. Opium, too, had been known, especially among artists and intellectuals. But heroin offered something different, stronger, smoother, quieter. It was not a stimulant, not a wildfire, but a gentle tide that carried one inward, away from noise, into a hush. The 1920s were years of searching. People searched for beauty, for truth, for sensation, for relief. Some found it in canvases filled with bold colors and abstract shapes. Some found it in pages filled with new words, new rhythms of thought. Some found it in dance, in music, in laughter that echoed into the night. And some found it in substances that softened reality. In that sense, heroin was simply another part of the search, another doorway to a different way of being. To see it clearly, one must also see the backdrop of Parisian daily life. In small apartments, families cooked simple meals, bread, cheese, soup simmering on stoves. Children played in courtyards, their voices echoing against stone walls. Workers rose early, their boots echoing as they walked to factories, to shops, to offices. Streetcars rattled along tracks, bells ringing as they stopped to collect passengers. Newsboys called headlines, their voices sharp against the murmur of traffic. This was the city's foundation, steady, practical, always moving. And over that foundation, another layer floated, the layer of dreamers, artists, wanderers. Their days began later, their nights stretched long. Their conversations wandered like the streets themselves. In their circles, heroin found a home, not as something shocking, but as something that fit the mood, the desire to step sideways out of ordinary time. The first wave of users was not the poor or the desperate, but the curious, the experimental, those who sought new horizons. Painters, writers, musicians, they were the ones who first folded it into their lives, often quietly, without mention in diaries or letters, as if it were too ordinary to note. It was not yet taboo, not yet forbidden, simply another shade in the spectrum of experience. I imagine again the Seine at midnight. The water moves steadily, the surface catching the light of lamps and stars. A couple walks hand in hand along the embankment, their shadows stretching long across the stones. A man sits alone on a bench, his coat pulled close, a cigarette glowing faintly between his fingers. Somewhere in a nearby flat, a window glows, and inside, someone lies back on a narrow bed, the city's sounds drifting in through the glass. Their breath slows, their body loosens, The weight of the world lifts just slightly, enough to make the night bearable. That was the quiet promise of heroin in 1920s Paris. Not chaos, not fire, but a softening, a hush, a moment of peace. And so, as the decade began, heroin was not yet a crisis, not yet a danger spoken of in newspapers or whispered of in warnings. It was simply there, as much a part of the city as the music, the smoke, the laughter, the sorrow. It was part of the story of Paris, written not in headlines but in glances, in sighs, in the unspoken spaces between words. The streets of Paris, in those years after the war, seemed to carry a rhythm all their own. At dawn, when the city was still quiet, the sound of carts rattling along cobblestones signaled the beginning of another day. Milk was delivered in glass bottles that clinked against one another. Bakers opened their shops, and the scent of fresh bread drifted outward in warm waves. The first commuters moved with steady steps, their coats pulled close, their breaths visible in the morning air, and as sunlight crept higher, the full life of the city stirred awake. In the mornings, the cafés opened their doors, welcoming those who needed a cup of coffee, a place to read the paper, or simply a corner to watch the world go by. Small tables spilled onto sidewalks, where men in hats and women in long coats settled in, their cups steaming before them. Newspapers crackled as pages were turned. The occasional sound of a bicycle bell rang sharp and brief, followed by the swift blur of wheels passing. These were quiet, ordinary moments, grounding the city in the simple routines of daily life. But Paris was never only ordinary. Even in its quietest hours, there was something atmospheric about the city, a sense of being suspended between reality and dream. It was in the way the morning light touched the facades of stone buildings, softening their edges. It was in the way the Seine reflected, a shimmer of silver beneath its bridges. It was in the layers of voices, footsteps, laughter, and song that gradually filled the air as day unfolded. And it was in the spaces between these sounds, the pauses, the hushes, where one could almost feel the city breathing. Writers often described Paris not just as a place, but as a presence, something alive. Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, F. Scott Fitzgerald, names now etched in memory, were then simply wanderers seeking meaning, scribbling words in notebooks, drinking coffee or wine at cafe tables, finding in the city both challenge and companionship. They were part of the lost generation, expatriates searching for grounding after the war, restless, uncertain, and yet profoundly alive. In their company, heroin sometimes appeared as quietly as a shadow, not always spoken of, rarely the center of attention, but lingering in corners, waiting in pockets, folded into evenings. It was not yet condemned, not yet feared, and so it was received without alarm. Some tried it only once, some adopted it as part of their rhythm, some whispered of it as if sharing a secret too fragile for the daylight. Evenings in Paris often began in cafés and ended in smoky clubs. By dusk, the streets filled again, footsteps echoing against stone, laughter spilling from doorways. In Montparnasse, the cafés buzzed with artists and writers, their voices mingling with the clatter of dishes, the strum of guitars. In Montmartre, the hilltop quarter, music rose from cabarets and small clubs, weaving into the night air. And in the Latin Quarter, students debated under gas lamps, their words quick, their gestures wide, their energy spilling outward into the streets. Inside the jazz clubs, the atmosphere was a world unto itself. Small rooms crowded with people, the air dense with smoke and candlelight, the music pulsing in rhythms that felt new and alive. Trumpets called out bright notes, saxophones answered with warm tones, pianos tumbled into cascades of sound, drums kept a heartbeat beneath it all, steady, driving, yet flexible. The music was not polished but alive, improvised, shifting moment by moment. Dancers found the pulse in their bodies, their movements loose, their laughter free. For many, jazz felt like liberation, a way of breaking through formality, of letting emotion move openly in such places. Heroin moved quietly, passed hand to hand with little ceremony. It was not like alcohol, loud and visible, not like absinthe with its rituals and its mystique. It was discreet, intimate, a gesture shared between friends or lovers. A vial might be tucked into a pocket, a packet folded into a purse. Those who used it often sought, not frenzy, but calm, a slowing down, a softening, a release from the heaviness that lingered after the war. The war itself had left shadows everywhere. Paris was spared the worst of the destruction, but memories were etched into the minds of those who had lived through it. Many bore scars, visible or hidden. Families grieved. Veterans carried silence with them, silences that stretched across years. To soften these burdens, people sought many forms of release: art, music, dance, conversation, and sometimes substances that offered respite. In this way, heroin was less an outsider than a companion to the city's healing, a whisper that promised stillness. Daily life in Paris was full of contrasts. In wealthier neighborhoods, apartments glowed with chandeliers, drawing rooms filled with laughter and music. Servants moved quietly through hallways, carrying trays of food, arranging flowers, tending fires. Dinner tables gleamed with polished silver and porcelain, meals accompanied by wine chosen with care. Meanwhile, in working-class districts, families shared smaller spaces, cooking stews in iron pots, mending clothes by lamplight, telling stories as they sat around the table. Children played games in courtyards, their voices echoing upward. Laundry hung from windows, bright against the stone. Yet whether rich or poor, all shared in the rhythm of the city, its markets, its cafés, its festivals, its silences. Markets were particularly vibrant. The Marché des Enfants Ruches, one of the oldest, filled with voices calling prices, with the scent of fresh herbs, with baskets of fruit stacked high. Women bargained over cuts of meat, men carried sacks of flour. Children darted between stalls, with sticky fingers clutching sweets. The clatter of metal scales, the rustle of paper bags, the calls of merchants created a music of its own. This was Paris at its most tangible, the place where daily sustenance was gathered, where neighbors met, where life continued in all its ordinariness. Amidst such ordinariness, the bohemian world flourished. Artists painted in cramped studios, their canvases propped against walls, their palettes thick with layers of color. Writers filled pages with half-formed thoughts, scraps of dialogue, beginnings of stories. Musicians carried their instruments from café to club, playing wherever they found a stage. For them, Paris was both home and challenge, a place that demanded effort, but also offered inspiration at every corner. And for some, heroin became part of that rhythm, a way to loosen the grip of self-consciousness, to drift into spaces where art might flow more freely. The use of heroin was not spoken of openly in newspapers or shouted in streets. It remained in quieter spaces, in whispers, in gestures, in the private hours of the night. For most, it was not scandalous but simply one more part of the city's wide tapestry of experiences. And so the decade unfolded, with jazz, with art, with laughter, with heroin drifting quietly through it all. Paris at night was a city transformed. The glow of electric lights shimmered across the Seine, reflections dancing on the water's surface. Bridges arched gracefully, their outlines softened by fog. Along boulevards, lampposts lined the way, casting pools of golden light. In the distance, the Eiffel Tower shimmered against the sky, a beacon that seemed both modern and eternal. Lovers strolled arm in arm, pausing to gaze at the river, to whisper words carried away by the breeze. Carriages and early automobiles rattled past, their wheels and engines blending into the hum of the city. And somewhere, in a quiet room, a vial was opened, a dose prepared. A moment of hush entered into. For those who sought it, heroin was less about adventure than about surrender. It was about letting go of weight, about allowing time to stretch into softness. It was about listening to the quiet between heartbeats, about drifting into a space where the world's edges blurred. In this, it matched the mood of many Parisians, a city yearning not for more noise, but for gentleness, for stillness, for moments of calm amidst the whirl of change. The 1920s in Paris were often called the Ines Falls, the crazy years, marked by exuberance and experimentation. But beneath the surface, they were also years of healing, of searching, of finding ways to live with memory and loss. Heroin, quiet and subtle, became part of that search, not yet a danger, not yet a headline, but a presence, woven gently into the fabric of the city. And so, in those years, Paris lived on two levels, the visible one of laughter, music, and light, and the quieter one of silence, sighs, and drifting thoughts. To walk its streets was to sense both, to feel the weight and the lightness intertwined, and within that intertwining, heroin found its place, not as a monster lurking in shadows, but as a whisper that moved softly through nights, as unnoticed as the fog rolling along the river. The middle years of the 1920s brought Paris to what many remembered as its brightest glow. It was a time when the city seemed to live in two tempos at once. By day, the rhythm was steady and familiar. Shopkeepers opened their shutters, children hurried off to school, and workers filled the streets with their purposeful steps. But by night, another rhythm awakened, one of improvisation and music, of late conversations and lingering glances, of movements unhurried, yet alive with energy. To wander Paris in those years was to see layers upon layers of life unfolding. Along the grand boulevards, elegant shops displayed dresses with low waistlines and shimmering beads. The style of the moment, tailors measured suits with precision, their chalk lines careful against dark fabrics. Perfume drifted from glass bottles in ornate windows, promising sophistication in a single scent. Automobiles rolled past, their engines purring, their polished surfaces catching the reflection of street lamps. Yet only a few blocks away, narrow alleys wound between older buildings where laundry fluttered from lines and cats prowled across rooftops. Here, women carried baskets of vegetables, children played marbles, and men in caps leaned on doors, smoking and watching the day pass. This coexistence of elegance and ordinariness gave Paris its particular charm. It was not only a place of glamour, but of texture, stone worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, doors painted and repainted, voices carrying from open windows. Even the air seemed to hold layers, the sharp scent of coal smoke, the sweet aroma of baking bread, the tank of wet cobblestones after rain. For those who lived there, these details were simply life. For those who came from afar, they were part of the city's magic. Among the expatriates who arrived in Paris, there was a sense of discovery. Writers like Ernest Hemingway found in the city both difficulty and inspiration. Days were spent writing in small apartments, their walls thin, their stoves unreliable. Evenings were often spent in cafés, where the noise of conversation surrounded them, where they felt both anonymous and connected. Gertrude Stein hosted gatherings in her salon, where paintings by Picasso and Matisse hung on the walls, and where conversations about literature and art stretched deep into the night. For these wanderers, Paris was more than a backdrop. It was a partner in their creative work, offering both challenge and companionship. Heroin, in this context, appeared quietly, slipping between conversations and into evenings. It was not the subject of debate in the salons, nor did it dominate the talk of the cafés, but it was there, folded into the private rituals of some artists and musicians, a part of the search for loosened thought, for softened experience. Its effect was subtle, more inward than outward, aligning with the reflective mood that often accompanied the creation of art. Where alcohol might make one loud, heroin made one quiet. Where absinthe might set the imagination on fire, heroin dimmed the lights and drew one inward. In the clubs of Montmartre, the music of jazz filled the air. Musicians from America and the Caribbean had brought it to Paris, and had found a home here, embraced with curiosity and delight. Trumpets and clarinets traded melodies, pianos rolled into syncopated chords, drums marked the beat with both precision and play. Dancers moved with a freedom that seemed new, their feet tapping out rhythms, their bodies swaying in ways that defied the old formalities. For some, this music was enough to carry them into other worlds. For others, heroin became an additional companion, a way to slow the pulse even as the music carried on. The clubs themselves were often small, with low ceilings and crowded tables. Candles flickered in glass holders, casting shadows on the walls. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, the scent of alcohol sharp and sweet. Conversations rose and fell in waves, punctuated by laughter, by applause, by the clink of glasses, and always, behind it all, the music pulsed, alive, insistent, unending. To step into such a place was to step into another tempo of life, one where time stretched and blurred. For some, heroin heightened this sense of suspension, making the hours flow into one another as smoothly as the music itself. Outside, the streets of Paris remained awake long after midnight. Vendors sold roasted chestnuts on corners, their fires glowing red against the night air. Couples strolled arm in arm, their breath visible in the cool air, their voices soft. Taxis rolled by, headlights cutting through the mist. The river reflected the glow of lamps, its surface rippling gently as if carrying the city's dreams. For those drifting home after long nights, Paris offered a quiet embrace, its familiar sounds and sights steadying, comforting. Heroin's place in all this remained understated. It was not yet the subject of fear or condemnation, but rather one more option in a city full of choices. For many, it was used sparingly, occasionally, as one might indulge in a glass of fine wine or a night of dancing. For others, it became a regular companion, a way to smooth the rough edges of days, to soften the memories that still lingered from war, to allow a sense of peace in a world that could feel overwhelming. Yet the city was not only about nights and substances. Daily life continued in its full texture. Children filled classrooms, chalk scratching on slates, teachers guiding lessons with patience. Markets bustled with activity, their colors and sounds filling the senses. Artisans worked in small shops, cobblers shaping leather, tailors sewing seams, bakers pulling golden loaves from ovens. Housewives swept steps, their brooms scratching against stone. Old men played cards in courtyards, their movements slow, their laughter deep. These rhythms grounded the city, giving it a solidity that balanced its flights of art and music. For many Parisians, the glamour of Montparnasse or Montmartre was distant, something spoken of but not lived. Their concerns were more immediate: earning a living, feeding a family, keeping warm in winter. Yet even for them, the city offered moments of beauty, the play of light on the river, the bells of churches ringing across rooftops, the scent of lilacs in spring. Paris belonged to all, not only to artists but to every person who walked its streets, who carried its rhythm in their steps. Heroin, though it touched many lives, remained more common in the circles of artists, musicians, and wanderers. Its association with creativity, with introspection, made it appealing to those who sought new perspectives, who wished to loosen the grip of conventional thought. But it was also present among others: students experimenting, couples seeking escape, individuals carrying private sorrows. It crossed boundaries quietly, not loudly, weaving itself into different layers of the city's life. As the decade moved forward, the world outside Paris also shifted. In America, prohibition pushed many to look toward Europe as a place of freedom. In Europe itself, politics grew tense, economies wavered, and yet Paris continued to glow. Its lights, its music, its conversations defying the unease. In this atmosphere of both brilliance and fragility, Heroin continued its quiet drift, part of the unseen threads that wove through the city's nights. Imagine again a Parisian night in 1925. In one apartment, a young painter cleans brushes, his canvas half finished, his mind drifting. Across the river, a group of friends share wine in a café, their laughter carrying into the street. In a club nearby, musicians play, their notes soaring, their bodies swaying. And in a quieter room, lit only by a small lamp, someone prepares a dose, their hands steady, their breaths slow, their thoughts loosening as they slip into a different rhythm of time. All of this is Paris, all of it woven together, all of it part of the same city breathing through the night. And so, as the decade unfolded, Paris continued to live in its two tempos, the visible one of music and laughter, and the quieter one of drifting silences. Heroin remained part of the latter, a presence felt but not spoken of, a whisper in the city's long song. By the later years of the 1920s, Paris shimmered like a jewel at night, its glow drawing people from every corner of the world. Travelers stepped off trains at the Gare du Nord and the Gare de l'Est, carrying suitcases, coats, and dreams of freedom. Some arrived to study, some to paint, some simply to wander. The city welcomed them all with its mixture of elegance and disorder, its boulevards wide and gleaming, its alleys narrow and worn, its cafés forever ready with a table and a chair. Paris by day still held its steady rhythm, but by evening it came alive in a new way. The city became a stage, each street a corridor of light, each café a theater of voices. Along the Champs-Élysées, crowds strolled beneath glowing lamps, their laughter mixing with the hum of traffic. In Montmartre, neon signs buzzed faintly above cabarets, their colors glowing in the mist. In Montparnasse, the cafés were so crowded that tables spilled into the streets, the noise of conversation rising like a tide. Jazz clubs, theaters, cinemas, and dance halls all competed for attention, offering Parisians and visitors alike endless choices of where to spend their nights. To sit in one of these cafés was to see the city at its most vibrant. Waiters in white aprons moved quickly between tables, balancing trays of glasses and plates. Musicians played softly in corners, their melodies drifting above the conversations. Artists sketched on napkins, their lines quick and loose. Writers bent over notebooks, their brows furrowed in concentration. Couples leaned close, whispering, laughing, their hands resting together on tabletops. Cigarette smoke curled upward, mingling with the scent of coffee, wine, and perfume. The atmosphere was rich but unhurried, a place where hours slipped by unnoticed. And yet beneath this brightness there was also fatigue. The endless nights of music and talk, of drinking and dancing, left many drained. Some found themselves seeking ways to extend the night, to keep the glow alive, to quiet the weariness that followed. Alcohol was the most common companion, followed by tobacco, absinthe, and the growing presence of cocaine. But heroin, softer, quieter, offered something different. It did not excite, but soothed. It did not inflame, but hushed. For those caught in the cycle of late nights and long mornings, it became a way to soften the edges, to drift gently into a pause. By this time, heroin had become more familiar, though still not widely discussed. It was not splashed across newspapers, not spoken of loudly in cafés, but it was there, woven into lives with increasing subtlety. Some artists kept small vials among their paints and brushes, using them in quiet moments between canvases. Musicians slipped it into their routines, finding in its calm a counterpoint to the energy of their performances. Writers searching for new forms, new voices, sometimes turned to it as a way of loosening thought, of allowing words to drift into unexpected shapes. But it was not only the world of art that knew heroin. Students, restless and searching, experimented. Lovers, in their intimacy, shared it as one might share a glass of wine or a whispered secret. Those who carried private burdens, memories of war, disappointments of life, longings unspoken, sometimes found in it a companion, quiet, unjudging, soft. The spread was not loud but gradual, a ripple through the city's undercurrent, touching more lives with each passing year. Daily life in Paris, however, remained full of the ordinary. Housewives visited markets each morning, their baskets filled with bread, fruit, and fish. Butchers arranged their cuts with practiced hands, their counters shining clean. Florists tied bouquets in paper, the petals bright against grey streets. Children clattered through courtyards, their shouts echoing off stone walls. Clerks hurried to offices, their footsteps brisk, their coats buttoned tight against the wind. Seamstresses bent over their work, stitching hems, mending seams. These rhythms gave the city its steadiness, its continuity. Even as the nights grew ever more extravagant, on Sundays, families strolled along the boulevards, their steps unhurried. Churches rang their bells, their chimes drifting over rooftops. In parks, children sailed small boats in fountains, their parents watching from benches. Musicians played violins or accordions on corners, their cases open for coins. The Seine reflected it all, the bridges, the lamps, the passing boats, its surface moving with slow certainty. Paris was a place of beauty for everyone, not only for those who filled the salons or the clubs, but also for those who lived its ordinary hours. The heroin that touched some lives did not erase this ordinariness. It existed alongside it, hidden in apartments, in quiet moments, in the spaces between the city's public rhythms. To walk the streets in the late 1920s was to sense this layering. The laughter of crowds above, the silence of private sighs beneath. The city held both, balanced delicately, without one overwhelming the other. The expatriates who had once arrived in Paris with excitement now settled more deeply into their lives. There, some achieved success, publishing novels, exhibiting paintings, performing music. Others struggled, caught between hope and disappointment, their work unnoticed, their efforts unrecognized. For all, Paris remained a place of both challenge and inspiration. And heroin, for those who knew it, became part of this tension, a comfort in failure, a hush in success, a constant presence in the ebb and flow of their days. The glamour of the late 1920s often hid the exhaustion beneath. Parties stretched until dawn, music filling halls, laughter spilling out into streets. The costumes were elaborate, the champagne flowed, the dancers whirled. But behind the glitter was weariness, a sense that the brightness could not last forever. Some sought escape in travel, in moving from city to city, always searching for new stimulation. Others turned inward, withdrawing into private worlds, seeking solace in substances that softened the noise. Heroin fit quietly into this atmosphere. It was not a drug of spectacle, not one that drew attention. It was discreet, intimate, personal. It offered not a blaze of light but a dimming, a quieting. For a generation that had known too much noise, too much violence, too much upheaval, This quiet was tempting. In this way, heroin became less a curiosity and more a companion, moving from the fringes into the fabric of the city's life. Imagine again a night in Paris in 1928. A jazz club pulses with music, the room crowded, the air thick with smoke. Dancers move, their laughter rising above the horns and drums. Glasses clink, conversations overlap. The night stretches long. A few streets away, in a quieter apartment, a writer sits at a desk, the pages before him blank, his thoughts heavy. On the table beside him rests a small vial. He reaches for it, his movements slow, steady. The city outside continues its rhythm, footsteps, voices, bells, while inside, another rhythm takes hold, softer, quieter, drifting. Both belong to Paris, both part of the same song. As the decade neared its end, this layering of glamour and weariness, of brilliance and hush, became more pronounced. Paris continued to shine, but its shine carried shadows. The heroin craze, though still quiet, was deepening, threading itself more firmly through the city's nights. It remained unspoken in newspapers, unnoticed by many, but for those who lived it, it was real, present, shaping their lives in ways subtle and profound. And so Paris in the late 1920s stood at its height, its lights glowing, its music alive, its people restless and searching. Heroin moved quietly through it all, a whisper in the brightness, a shadow in the glow, a presence as much a part of the city as its laughter, its sorrow, its endless rhythm of life. The final years of the 1920s arrived in Paris with a glow that seemed almost too bright. The boulevards sparkled with lights, the theaters were full, and the dance halls were louder than ever. The Exposition Internationale of 1925 had given the city a renewed energy, a sense of being at the very center of modernity. Everywhere there were signs of confidence. Buildings rose in new shapes, streamlined, geometric, touched by the language of Art Deco. Posters filled walls with bold colors, advertising cigarettes, perfumes, automobiles. The cafés of Montparnasse overflowed with young artists and older patrons, their laughter mingling with the clatter of glasses. Paris seemed, to many, invincible, and yet, beneath this surface brilliance, small tremors of unease had already begun to stir. The world economy, though not yet broken, carried strains that only a few noticed. Prices shifted subtly. Investments that once seemed steady grew uncertain. Those who watched closely saw the edges of the glow beginning to fray. But for most, Paris remained a stage of laughter, music, and restless energy. On any given evening, the city's rhythm unfolded as it always had. Along the boulevards, couples walked arm in arm, stopping at kiosks for newspapers or flowers. Theaters filled with audiences, their coats heavy on the backs of seats, their eyes fixed on the stage. In cabarets, singers performed beneath glittering lights, their voices rising above the smoke. At small tables, men and women leaned close to hear each other over the music, their hands resting on glasses of champagne. Cigarette smoke drifted upward in pale ribbons, caught in the glow of chandeliers. The air was thick but alive, filled with sound, scent, and warmth. In Montmartre, the atmosphere was more bohemian, but no less intense. Painters filled narrow studios with canvases, the scent of turpentine mingling with dust. Writers scratched at notebooks in dim cafés, pausing often to stare into the smoke and the chatter. Musicians, both local and expatriate, played in clubs where the music was wild and free, the rhythm of jazz mingling with French chansons. The nights here were long, and the mornings uncertain. Those who stumbled out into the pale light of dawn found themselves surrounded by the quiet of shuttered shops and empty streets, the city asleep while they sought their way home. It was in these hidden hours, between the glow of night and the calm of morning, that heroin most often made its quiet presence felt. Unlike the bright clinking of glasses or the rush of laughter, it belonged to the hush, to the small apartments where curtains were drawn, to the studios where canvases waited, to the corners of lives where silence pressed more heavily than sound. Its effect was not one of excitement but of release, a loosening of tension, a drifting away from the burdens that clung to waking hours. By 1929, heroin was no longer entirely foreign to Parisian life. It was not spoken of openly, but it was known, passed quietly from hand to hand, circle to circle. Some used it rarely, almost experimentally, touching its calm only from time to time. Others folded it into their routines, a steady presence in their days and nights. It did not dominate the city, but it threaded through it, a shadow among lights. Life for most Parisians, however, remained rooted in ordinary rhythms. Mornings began with the smell of bread from bakeries, the sound of milkmen's steps on cobblestones, the ringing of church bells. Markets filled with voices and the bright colors of fruit and vegetables. Housewives carried baskets, speaking softly with vendors, while children tugged at their sleeves. In working-class neighborhoods, men set off to factories and workshops, their tools carried in leather bags, their boots leaving steady tracks through the morning dust. These lives did not shimmer with the same glamour as the cafés of Montparnasse, but they formed the true heartbeat of the city. For them, heroin remained distant, almost invisible. It was not the drug of streets or markets, but of private rooms and quiet circles. The shoemaker who rose at dawn, the laundress who worked long hours, the postal clerk who sorted letters. These people's lives were marked more by fatigue and modest pleasures than by intoxication. Their comforts were found in bread, in wine, in family meals, in Sunday walks. The craze that touched the artists and the restless belonged to another Paris, one that brushed against theirs but did not fully overlap. Still, even in these quieter quarters, whispers could be heard. A young man in a boarding house who kept odd hours, a woman who seemed always pale, a neighbor who withdrew from gatherings. The signs were subtle, rarely named, but not unseen. Paris was a city where lives were layered, each street holding both brightness and shadow, and in the late 1920s, heroin was one of those shadows, slipping softly across boundaries. As the decade drew toward its close, the world beyond Paris began to shift. In October of 1929, the stock market crash in New York sent ripples across the Atlantic. At first, Paris continued as if unchanged, the lights still bright, the theaters still full, the cafés still crowded. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tone of the city began to change. Investors grew cautious, merchants hesitated, families felt unease. By the early 1930s, the effects became clearer. Jobs were lost, savings diminished, optimism faltered. For those who had built their lives on constant movement, constant brightness, the slowing of the city was disquieting. The nights remained full, but the laughter was thinner, the confidence less sure. Some found comfort in gathering more closely, relying on friendship, family, and community. Others, already familiar with the quiet hush of heroin, leaned into it more heavily. In a time of growing uncertainty, its promise of release, of temporary peace, became more alluring. Picture a Parisian evening in 1930. A café still glows with lamplight, but the tables are less crowded than before. A pianist plays softly, his notes falling gently into the air. A waiter, moving more slowly than he once did, polishes glasses between serving. Outside, the streets are quieter, the voices fewer. The city remains beautiful, but there is a subtle change in its rhythm, a slowing, a sigh. In an apartment not far away, a young couple, feeling the weight of bills and the uncertainty of tomorrow, sits together in silence. On the table rests a small vial. They do not speak as they reach for it, but in the quiet they share. They find a fragile kind of comfort. The heroin craze of Paris was never a loud storm. It was not a frenzy that swept across the city all at once. It was more like mist, drifting quietly, settling softly, touching some lives deeply while passing others by. By the close of the 1920s and into the early 1930s, it had become part of Paris's hidden texture, one thread among many in the tapestry of the city. It was not the whole of Paris, not even most of it, but it was there, quietly present, as the city shifted from brightness into uncertainty. And yet, life continued. Children still played in parks, boats still floated down the Seine, bells still rang from church towers, painters still lifted brushes, writers still pressed pens to paper, musicians still played. The glow of Paris did not vanish, it only dimmed slightly, shadowed by the times, softened by uncertainty. Heroin remained in the shadows with it, a quiet presence, never overwhelming but always near, a reflection of the city's longing for rest, for quiet, for peace. The 1920s, once dazzling and bright, now slipped into memory, and Paris entered a new decade, carrying with it both the brilliance and the burdens of what had come before. The 1930s in Paris began, not with a crash of sound, but with a sigh. The brilliance of the past decade lingered faintly, like the echo of music once loud but now fading into memory. The cafés still stood, their tables and chairs still waiting, but the voices that once crowded them came more slowly. The boulevards were still alive with lights, but the glow seemed thinner, as if dimmed by a haze. The economic downturn, creeping quietly across Europe, touched the city in ways both subtle and plain. Shops closed earlier, merchants hesitated to extend credit. Families who had once gone to the theater every week now went only once a month. The difference was not dramatic, but it was felt in the texture of daily life, a gentle tightening, a smaller circle of possibility. Still, Paris endured. Each morning, bakeries filled the air with the smell of warm bread. Baskets swung from the arms of women who moved briskly through markets, choosing apples, onions, cheese, and loaves with care. The cries of vendors echoed against stone walls, their voices carrying above the chatter. Children clattered past with school satchels, their steps quick, their laughter light. Carriages and automobiles shared the streets, their wheels clicking over cobblestones, their engines humming low. The Seine reflected it all, calm, steady, untroubled by the mood of the city. In the evenings, Paris still offered its charms. Couples walked along the riverbanks, pausing beneath bridges to watch the water. Musicians set up in squares, their violins and accordions soft against the night air. In Montmartre, a few clubs still pulsed with music, though not as brightly as before. In Montparnasse, the cafés were less crowded, their tables no longer spilling into the streets as they once had. Conversation continued, but with less frenzy, more reflection. The city was not silent, but it was quieter, a little slower, more subdued. For artists, this new mood brought both challenge and clarity. Painters continued to work in small studios, their canvases leaning against walls, their brushes dipped in muted colors. Writers bent over desks, their lamps casting golden light onto pages. Musicians still played in smoky rooms, their melodies softer, less urgent, but still alive. The spirit of creation had not vanished, but it had changed, shaped by the time less exuberant, more contemplative, tuned to the subtler tones of life. And through all of this, Heroin remained, quiet as ever, its presence woven into the city's hush. By now, it was not new, not startling, but known, though rarely named. In apartments with heavy curtains, in studios scattered with brushes and notebooks, it lay close at hand, a small vial on a table, a whisper of powder in a fold of cloth. Its role was not dramatic. It did not dominate the city's story. Instead, it softened its edges, blurring sharpness, easing weight. For some, it was a way of resting when the world felt heavy. For others, it was a habit, steady and unspoken. Picture a Parisian evening in 1932, in a working-class neighborhood. A family gathers for supper. The table is simple: bread, a pot of stew, a bottle of red wine. The children chatter, their voices bright, their laughter quick. The parents listen, smiling softly, though the weight of bills and work lingers behind their eyes. Outside, the street is dim, the lamps casting long shadows, the air cool with the hint of rain. Across the city, in a cramped studio in Montparnasse, a young painter sits alone. His canvas waits, half finished, the colors muted, his hands still. On the table beside him lies a small vial, a quiet promise of calm. He reaches for it, not with excitement, but with relief, seeking the soft pause it offers. This was how Heroin lived in Paris in the 1930s, not as a spectacle, but as a sigh. Not in the roar of the city, but in its silences. Not in the laughter of crowded halls, but in the hush of private rooms. It moved quietly, touching lives in ways subtle, hidden, personal. The cafés, though quieter, remained central to life. Even in harder times, a cup of coffee, a glass of wine, a seat at a small table were treasures. Conversations lingered long into the evening, less about extravagance and more about endurance, about finding meaning in slower days. Newspapers lay folded on tables, their headlines about politics, economics, change. People read them, frowned, shook their heads, then returned to their conversations, to their friends, to their small joys. Theaters still glowed, though fewer could afford them. Those who went found comfort in the flicker of light, the sweep of music, the unfolding of stories on stage. In cinemas, black and white films played, their silent figures moving across screens, their dramas unspoken yet understood. Audiences sat quietly, their faces lit by the glow, their minds carried elsewhere for a time. It was in these moments of escape that Paris found its resilience, its way of continuing, of holding beauty even when the world pressed in. Heroin, too, was part of this search for escape, though of a quieter kind. It did not bring laughter or spectacle. but a gentler release, a dimming of edges, a floating pause. For those who carried burdens, financial, emotional, creative, it was a way of softening the weight. It was not universal, not everywhere, but for those who knew it, it was present, steady, woven into the fabric of their days. As the decade moved forward, the mood of Europe grew heavier. Political tensions stirred in Germany, Italy, and Spain, whispers of unrest that would grow louder with time. In Paris, the awareness of these changes was muted, distant, but not absent. Newspapers carried reports. Cafés hummed with quiet conversations, some worried, some dismissive. Life continued, but with an undercurrent of unease, a sense that the world was shifting again. Paris in the 1930s was still beautiful, still alive, but it was a different beauty than the brilliance of the 1920s. It was softer, quieter, more fragile. Its light was not gone, but gentler, shaded by uncertainty. The heroin craze, if it could be called that, fit this mood perfectly. Not loud, not showy, but subdued, intimate, hidden. It belonged to the hush, to the spaces between words, to the sighs that followed laughter. Imagine the city on a winter's night in 1935. Snow falls lightly, dusting rooftops, softening streets. Lamps glow in the whiteness, their light diffused, gentle. In a café, a small group of friends gathers, their voices low, their hands wrapped around cups of hot wine. They talk of art, of politics, of dreams, their conversation a shield against the cold. Across the city, in an attic room, a writer sits at a desk, his window frosted, his lamp burning low. The page before him is blank, his thoughts heavy, his hands still. On the table beside him lies a vial, familiar, waiting. He reaches for it as snow continues to fall, silent and steady outside. This was Paris in the 1930s, a city still glowing, but more softly. A city still alive, but more slowly. A city still dreaming, but more quietly. Heroin was part of that quiet, a presence as hushed as snowfall, as hidden as shadows, as soft as a sigh. And so the decade unfolded, year by year, its rhythm slower than before, its mood gentler, more subdued. Paris endured, its beauty never lost, its spirit never broken. The heroin that touched some of its lives remained not as a blaze, but as a whisper, a faint note in the city's endless song. By the middle of the 1930s, Paris was a city living in two rhythms at once. On the surface, daily life continued with its familiar steadiness. Bread was still bought each morning, flowers still sold in markets, schoolchildren still chattered as they hurried along the sidewalks. But beneath that surface, another rhythm pulsed slower, heavier, more uncertain, shaped by the growing turbulence of the wider world. In cafés, the topics of conversation had shifted. Where once artists had debated the merits of a painting or the flow of a poem, now voices turned more often to politics. Newspapers lay open on tables, their black letters shouting of unrest abroad. Spain torn apart by civil war. Germany reshaping itself under a new and troubling regime. Italy moving restlessly under its own leader. Some read with worry, others with dismissal, but few could deny that the air of Europe had grown tense. Paris, though still filled with beauty, now carried the echo of storms gathering beyond its borders. And yet, even in these uneasy years, the rhythms of ordinary life carried the city forward. The smell of roasted chestnuts in winter still filled the streets, mingling with the faint smoke of chimneys. Along the Seine, booksellers still opened their green boxes, their stalls lined with volumes old and new. Children still tugged at their mothers' hands in markets, their eyes drawn to sweets and fruit. Lovers still met under lamplight, their whispered laughter soft against the hum of passing cars. The essence of Paris endured, even as shadows lengthened. The heroin presence in this time matched the city's shifting mood. It was never loud, never dramatic, but quiet, steady, hushed. For some, it was a way of softening the edge of uncertainty. When the future seemed heavy, when the news grew dark, the small vial on a table offered a pause, a way of dimming the noise, of resting the mind. It was not the wild indulgence of the 1920s, but the subdued retreat of the 1930s, a quiet gesture, a slow exhale, a drifting into hush. Picture a Parisian night in 1937. The cafés are not as crowded as they once were, but voices still rise, smoke still curls above tables. A poet leans back in his chair, his eyes distant, the newspaper folded before him with its troubling headlines. Across the room, a young couple talks quietly, their hands touching, their smiles faint but real. Outside, the lamps glow on damp streets, the pavement shining with rain, and in a nearby apartment, a musician sits alone, his violin resting beside him, his body tired from the day's labor. On the table lies a vial. He reaches for it, not with celebration, but with weariness, seeking a moment of stillness. The city breathes on, the rain falls, the Seine moves slowly in the dark dot. As the decade deepened, Paris found itself both resilient and restless. The great exhibitions still drew visitors, the theaters still staged plays, the cinemas still flickered with light, but the laughter was thinner, the applause less certain, the nights shorter. The world was leaning toward something heavy, and even those who avoided newspapers could feel it in the air. The cafés, though alive, seemed to carry more sighs between their songs. For the ordinary Parisian, life remained a mixture of work and small pleasures. In the mornings, men and women crowded onto trams and buses, their faces calm but tired, their hands gloved against the cold. In shops, clerks wrapped packages in paper and twine, their movements precise, practiced. Schoolchildren sang their lessons, their voices rising from classrooms like bright notes above the city's hum. Families gathered at tables, their meals modest but shared, their conversations weaving through the worries of the day. These moments of togetherness gave balance to the uncertainty, a reminder that even in troubled times, life found its rhythm. But heroin lived quietly within these rhythms, most often unseen. It was not a drug of markets or trams, but of private spaces, of the hours after work was done, of the moments when silence felt heavier than noise. A clerk might return to his room, fold his coat over a chair, and sit quietly by the window. A student, overwhelmed by studies and the weight of the world, might find relief in the vial hidden in a drawer. A woman who worked long hours in a garment shop might seek calm in the hush it offered, away from the clatter of machines. These were not grand stories, but small ones, private, intimate, hushed. By 1938, the tension in Europe was unmistakable. Conversations grew sharper, the headlines darker. Paris felt it, even as its lamps still glowed, and its cafés still opened each night. People read, discussed, worried. Some grew restless, traveling, moving, seeking change. Others grew stiller, drawing closer to family and friends, staying near to what they knew. The city seemed to hold its breath, waiting, uncertain. Through it all, heroin remained a quiet companion for those who sought it. It did not answer questions, did not resolve tensions, but it softened them. It dulled the edges of fear, slowed the rush of thoughts, gave a moment's rest in a time when rest was hard to find. In this way, it mirrored the city itself, not gone, not broken, but subdued, waiting, holding on in quiet resilience. Imagine again a night in Paris in 1939. The streets are damp, the air cool, the lamps glowing softly in the mist. A café is open, its tables scattered with a few late-night patrons, their voices low. A man sits with a glass of wine, staring into it as if it might tell him what tomorrow holds. Across the city, in a narrow flat, a painter cleans his brushes, his canvas left unfinished. On the table, beside the paint and turpentine, lies a vial, its presence as familiar as the brushes themselves. He reaches for it quietly, his motions slow, his body weary. Outside, the city hums with silence, the distant echo of footsteps, the faint call of a night watchman. The Seine flows steadily, its waters dark and endless. The heroin craze of Paris had never been a loud roar, and in these later years it was softer than ever, a whisper within a whisper. Yet it was there, woven into the fabric of life, into the sighs of the weary, the pauses of the anxious, the silences of the uncertain. It belonged to the hush of the city, to the private moments, to the quiet nights. As Paris stood at the edge of another storm, heroin remained as it had always been, discreet, hidden, intimate. It was not the story of Paris, not the whole of it, but one of its shadows, one of its sighs, one of its soft and secret companions. And so the late 1930s unfolded, year by year, its rhythm slower, its mood heavier, its beauty softened by shadow. Paris endured, still glowing, still breathing, still alive, even as the world darkened around it. And within its quiet heart, heroin remained, a thread in its tapestry, as soft and elusive as the mist above the Seine. When the 1940s arrived, Paris felt the slow tightening of history's hand. The decade opened, not with celebration, but with uncertainty. The previous years had carried whispers of unrest, but now the whispers had become clear. The war that many had dreaded was no longer distant. By the summer of 1940, the city that had been a beacon of art, of thought, of music, and of joy, found itself under the heavy shadow of occupation. The German forces entered Paris not with fire and ruin, but with silence. The city surrendered without a battle, and for many, this silence was the most haunting sound of all. One morning, Parisians awoke to find the streets changed. Soldiers stood at corners where vendors once sold flowers. Uniformed men crossed bridges that had carried lovers' footsteps. The tricolor flags had vanished, replaced by banners of another kind. The cafés still opened, the bells still rang, the Seine still flowed, but all with a hush, as if the city itself held its breath. Daily life continued, though shaped by scarcity. Bread was rationed, and lines formed outside bakeries each morning, people waiting patiently for their portion. Coffee was replaced with chicory, its taste bitter and thin, but warming nonetheless. Meat became a rare luxury, and families learned to stretch vegetables into soups, their kitchens filled with the scent of cabbage and potatoes. The markets still held color, though less abundance, and the sound of vendors calling out was softer now, carrying not cheer but fatigue. Children still played, their laughter echoing in courtyards, though their games were quieter, their movements watched by cautious parents. In schools, lessons were given as before, though books grew worn and materials scarce. Teachers spoke with care, aware of listening ears beyond their classrooms. Yet the rhythm of education carried on, a thread of normalcy woven into the fabric of uncertainty, and always the Seine moved steadily, its waters reflecting the grey skies, its flow unbroken. Barges still passed along its surface, though fewer than before, and lovers still walked its banks, their steps slow, their words whispered. The city endured, even beneath the watchful eyes of occupation. It was in this muted landscape that heroin lingered, not loud, not visible, but present, quiet, folded into the city's shadows. For some, it was a way of retreating from the heaviness of the world outside. The sound of boots on cobblestones, the sight of ration lines, the quiet fear in conversations, all of these pressed on the mind, and in the solitude of a room, in the dim light of a lamp, the vial offered a pause. It was not about glamour or indulgence now, but about stillness, about escape from the weight of silence that hung over Paris. Imagine an apartment in 1941. The curtains are drawn against the street, the room lit by a single lamp. A family sits at the table, their meal modest bread, thin soup, perhaps a small piece of cheese. They eat quietly, the clink of cutlery the only sound. Later, when the children sleep, the parents speak in whispers, their words careful. And in another room, a young man sits alone, his thoughts heavy, his body weary from waiting in lines, from carrying papers, from the endless quiet. On the table before him lies a vial. He reaches for it slowly, almost tenderly, seeking not excitement, but relief, a moment of forgetting. Outside, the city is still. A patrol passes, boots striking the pavement in steady rhythm. The Seine flows, quiet, endless. For others, heroin in this era was tied to the underground, to those who lived in secrecy. The networks that once trafficked goods now found new paths, sometimes alongside those who resisted the occupation in other ways. Smuggling was not only about profit, but about survival. Medicines, coffee, wine, and yes, even heroin, passed quietly from hand to hand. These exchanges were not open, but hidden, whispered, discreet. The city's veins carried not just water and power, but secret lifelines that kept small comforts alive in times of scarcity. The atmosphere of Paris during these years was one of contrasts. In some neighborhoods, life seemed almost unchanged. Shops still opened, people still bought bread, children still carried school satchels. In others, the signs of control were sharper. Soldiers at corners, posters on walls, curfews enforced. For many, life became about moving carefully, about speaking softly, about carrying on without drawing notice. Yet within this carefulness, the city's humanity remained. The baker who gave a child a slightly larger piece of bread, the neighbor who shared soup with another, the small acts of kindness that softened the edges of fear. Heroin in these times mirrored the city's quiet resilience. It was never a cure, never a solution, but a small comfort, a way of softening the weight of survival. A factory worker might return to his flat after long hours and find rest in its hush. An artist, his canvases unsold, might turn to it in the stillness of night. A woman who worked in a café by day might find solace in the quiet relief it offered before sleep. These moments were private, hidden, folded into the silence of occupied Paris. By 1942 and 1943, the war's shadow deepened. Rations grew stricter, lines longer, winters were cold, fuel scarce. People bundled themselves in layers, their breath visible in kitchens and bedrooms. Yet still, life continued. Children grew, families gathered, markets opened. Paris endured, its beauty subdued but not erased. The Seine still reflected the lights of bridges, the bells of churches still rang. Though muffled by distance, in these years, Heroin was not the story of Paris, but it was a thread in its tapestry, a quiet thread, woven through the private lives of those who sought a moment's rest from a world heavy with silence. It existed alongside the smell of rationed bread, the sound of boots on stone, the whisper of voices behind closed doors. Imagine again a night in 1944. The city is dark, its lights dimmed, its streets quiet under curfew. A lone lamp glows in a window, its light golden against the black. Inside, a man sits at a table, his face lined with fatigue. On the table lies a loaf of bread, half gone, a small pot of soup, now empty. Beside it, a vial rests, its glass catching the lamp's glow. He reaches for it with hands that tremble slightly, his breath slow, his eyes tired. Outside, the city waits, its silence deep, its future uncertain. The Seine flows on, steady, patient, endless. And then, in the summer of 1944, the silence broke. The liberation of Paris arrived with a sudden swell of sound. Bells rang out, voices rose in cheers, footsteps pounded the streets, not with fear but with joy. The banners returned, the flags unfurled, the city found its voice again. And yet, even in this joy, the scars remained. Years of occupation had left their mark on the buildings, on the streets, on the people. Paris breathed again, but its breath was heavy, shaped by memory. Through it all, Heroin had been present, quiet, discreet. In times of joy, it had been a companion of indulgence. In times of shadow, it had been a companion of stillness. Now, as the war's weight lifted, it remained, not gone, not forgotten, but part of the city's private history, a whisper within its endless song. When the war finally ended, Paris entered a period that was both relief and exhaustion. The bells rang out with joy, the streets filled with crowds, the flags returned to their places, but the celebrations were brief compared to the work ahead. For years, the city had been quiet, constrained, shadowed by occupation. Now, it was free again, but freedom itself came with a weight. Buildings had to be repaired, supplies had to be restored, lives had to be mended. The late 1940s in Paris were not marked by the golden glow of the earlier decades, nor the hush of occupation, but by a steady rhythm of rebuilding. The streets bustled again, but not with the same easy abundance. People walked with purpose, carrying sacks of food, bundles of clothing, crates of materials. The markets, once thin and quiet, began to swell again, though unevenly. Bread was more plentiful, vegetables stacked high again on tables, fruit brightening the stalls. Yet there was still rationing in the early years, still lines outside shops, still shortages that reminded everyone that scars did not heal in a day. Children who had known only war were suddenly able to laugh in open streets. Their games echoed in courtyards, their shoes striking against cobblestones as they ran, their shouts carrying far. They had grown in shadow, and now they found themselves in light. Schools filled again, their lessons brighter, their teachers more at ease, though the memories of wartime lingered in their eyes. Families gathered more freely, their tables filled with food once scarce. Soup pots bubbled with meat again, the sense of stews and roasts rising into apartment halls. Wine returned to dinners, not always fine, but enough to remind Parisians of their traditions, their shared rituals. In cafés, the chatter returned. For years, voices had been hushed, cautious, measured. Now, conversations spilled into the air again, rising above the clink of glasses and the strum of guitars. The talk was often practical: work, wages, rebuilding, politics, but it was talk nonetheless. The comfort of voices filling the air. Smoke once again curled lazily above tables, mingling with the scent of coffee. This time real coffee, not chicory substitutes. The cafés had survived, and now they breathed again, their doors open wide, their tables filled with life. The Seine, too, seemed to reflect the city's shift. Barges moved more steadily across its surface, carrying goods vital for rebuilding. The bridges were crowded with footsteps, with bicycles, with carts. Lovers once again leaned against railings, their faces turned toward the water, their hands linked. The river, eternal, had seen occupation and liberation, and now it witnessed renewal. Its waters carried away the heaviness of the past, even as they held the reflections of a city still marked by it, and heroin, as it had in all the years before, remained present, though altered by the times. In the exuberance of the 1920s, it had been an indulgence, part of a culture of excess and curiosity. In the silent years of occupation, it had been a retreat, a way of escaping the heavy stillness. Now, in the late 1940s, it found itself woven into the spaces between rebuilding and memory. For some, it was a continuation, a habit that had survived the war. For others, it became a means of softening the weight of post-war fatigue, of quieting the memories that lingered too vividly. Picture a small apartment in 1946. The paint on the walls is chipped, the furniture worn, but the space is warm. A pot simmers on the stove, filling the room with the smell of onions and broth. A woman sets the table for her children, their laughter echoing as they wait. Later, when the children are asleep, she sits by the window, looking out at the street below. She has worked long hours in a factory, her body weary, her mind full of memories she would rather not recall. On the table beside her is a small vial. She reaches for it quietly, not with a sense of luxury, but with a sense of relief. The city outside hums with rebuilding, but within her room there is a pause, a quiet moment of rest. In the cafés too, there were those who leaned on heroin, though discreetly. Among the artists who returned to their work, some found themselves unable to shake the shadows of war. Painters who had seen destruction found it difficult to return to bright canvases. Writers who had lived in silence now struggled to find words. For some, heroin offered a quiet refuge, a slowing of thoughts, a stilling of hands. It was not about inspiration so much as it was about pause, a moment in which the memories could blur, the heaviness could soften. Yet the presence of heroin was not dominant. Paris in the late 1940s was defined more by resilience than by indulgence. Families worked to restore their homes, communities rebuilt their neighborhoods, workers pushed forward to repair what had been broken. The drug was there, quiet, a thread woven through private lives, but the larger story was one of recovery. Paris was a city rediscovering its voice, its laughter, its rhythm. The heroin was simply one of many quiet undercurrents, like a shadow along a wall. By 1947 and 1948, the city had grown more lively. The rationing began to ease, markets filled with greater variety. The cafés grew brighter, their tables more crowded. Jazz returned to the nights, its rhythms once again spilling through doorways into the streets. People danced again, their movements light, their faces animated. After years of silence, the sound of music was more than entertainment, it was healing. Imagine a dance hall in 1948. The air is thick with smoke, the music loud, the crowd alive. Couples spin across the floor, their laughter rising above the brass and drums. At the tables, friends raise glasses, their conversations quick and excited. The shadows of war are not forgotten, but in this moment, they are held at bay. And yet, in a quieter corner, away from the lights, a small group sits apart. They speak little, their motions slow. On their table, hidden from view, lies the small comfort of heroin. Their world is not the dance floor, but the hush of retreat, the slowing of time. Both realities exist within the same city, the same night. Paris holds them together, its light and its shadow side by side. By the decade's end, Paris had transformed again. The scars of war were still visible, but the city had reclaimed its pulse. The cafés hummed, the markets bustled, the Seine reflected light once more. Families were stronger, children taller, communities closer. The memories of silence lingered, but life had returned, fuller and steadier. And within this life, heroin remained a quiet presence, never central, never gone, always woven into the private spaces of the city. The late 1940s closed with Paris poised between past and future. It was a city that had known joy, silence, hardship, and resilience. Its people had endured, and now they looked forward. The lights of the theaters glowed once again, the voices of poets rose again, the laughter of children echoed again. Paris had survived, and more than survived, it had endured with grace, with strength, with its beauty intact. and heroin, as always, had been there in its shadows. Through celebration, through silence, through rebuilding, it had flowed quietly, discreetly, a companion to those who sought its stillness. It was not the heart of Paris, but it was one of its sighs, one of its whispers, part of the city's endless song. The 1950s arrived in Paris with the feeling of fresh air after a long confinement. The war was over, the rationing eased, the streets full once more of goods, voices, and music. For many, the decade began with a sense of optimism, of possibility, of life rediscovered. The scars of the 1940s had not vanished, but they had softened, their edges blurred by time and resilience. The city moved forward, its rhythm steady, its light brightening. Each morning Paris stirred with familiar sounds, the rattling of trams, the ringing of bicycle bells, the chatter of schoolchildren. Bakers pulled warm loaves from ovens, the scent of fresh bread drifting through narrow streets. Cafés opened their doors, steam rising from cups of strong coffee, chairs arranged neatly on sidewalks, market stalls filled with fruits, vegetables, and cheeses, their colors vivid after years of scarcity. Housewives haggled with vendors, baskets filling with the bounty of a more generous time. The Seine reflected it all, its surface carrying the glow of lamps by night and the shimmer of sunlight by day. Barges moved steadily along its waters, their decks piled with goods, their crews calling out as they passed under bridges. Lovers leaned against its stone walls, their hands entwined, their faces turned toward the water. Artists set up easels along its banks, their canvases capturing the light, the motion, the timeless beauty of the river. Paris in the 1950s was not just a city of routine, it was a city of culture, of imagination, of renewal. The theaters filled again, their stages alive with voices, their seats packed with audiences hungry for art. Cinemas glowed with marquee lights, their screens alive with stories. Jazz spilled from basements and smoky clubs, its rhythms fast, then slow, then fast again, carrying with it the energy of the new era. Writers filled the cafés once more, their notebooks open, their pens scratching, their voices debating the weight of words. On the left bank, in the heart of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, philosophy mingled with jazz. The cafés were crowded with students and thinkers, their conversations winding late into the night. Names like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir floated through the air, their ideas debated over cups of coffee and glasses of wine. Smoke rose above the tables, laughter mingled with seriousness, and the sound of a saxophone from a nearby club punctuated the words. It was within this vibrant atmosphere that heroin continued its quiet presence. It did not dominate, did not overwhelm, but it existed, tucked into corners of the city's life. Among some artists and musicians, it became a way of softening the edges of long nights, of stilling the rush of thoughts, of drifting into silence after hours of intensity. In apartments above the cafés, behind closed shutters, a vial might rest on a table beside a notebook, a paintbrush, or an instrument. It was never the whole story, but always a shadow in the background, a quiet sigh within the noise. Picture a jazz club in 1953. The room is dim, filled with smoke, the stage lit by a single lamp. A saxophonist leans into his instrument, his body swaying with the rhythm, the notes rising and falling, weaving through the air like a river of sound. The crowd sits close together, their faces half hidden in shadow, their eyes fixed on the stage. Glasses clink, voices murmur, smoke curls upward. In a corner table, two men sit in silence, their conversation finished, their eyes distant. On their table, hidden beneath a folded napkin, lies a vial. Later, when the music ends and the crowd disperses, they will walk through the damp streets, the sound of the last note lingering, the vial a quiet companion in their pockets. For many Parisians, life in the 1950s was about rebuilding not just the city, but the spirit. Families grew again, children filled classrooms, workers returned to steady employment, shops filled with goods, fashions flourished, cinema boomed. The Eiffel Tower gleamed in the sunlight, the Champs-Élysées filled with footsteps, the parks overflowed with families on Sundays. These scenes of joy, of normalcy, of renewal, defined the decade. Yet in the private spaces, heroin remained, not loud but steady, like a whisper carried through the city's walls. By the middle of the decade, Paris had regained its international allure. Visitors came from abroad, drawn by its art, its food, its romance, its reputation as the cultural heart of Europe. The cafés of Montparnasse filled with voices speaking English, Italian, German, their words mingling with French in a tapestry of sound. Tourists leaned over maps, students scribbled in notebooks, painters set up canvases in the open air. The city thrived, and with it, so too did its shadows. For the ordinary Parisian, the heroin presence was often invisible. It was not sold in markets or advertised in clubs, but passed quietly, discreetly, from one hand to another. It lived in apartments, in studios, in the back rooms of certain cafés. Its use was not a spectacle, but a secret, a private moment of hush, in a city otherwise bursting with energy. A young poet might turn to it after hours of writing, his hand aching, his mind restless. A musician might seek it after a performance, when the applause had faded but the adrenaline still surged. A painter might reach for it in the quiet of dawn, when the canvas stared back in silence. Yet for every moment of retreat, Paris offered moments of brilliance. The laughter of children in parks, the voices of lovers on bridges, the applause in theaters, the clink of glasses in cafes. The city was alive with possibility, its scars fading, its lights shining brighter. Heroin was a part of this world, but only a part. One of many currents flowing through the river of Parisian life. By 1957 and 1958, the city was firmly rooted in its new rhythm. Fashion houses flourished, their designs shaping global trends. The cinemas showcased films that would become classics. Jazz had taken root, not just in clubs but in the identity of the city itself. Students filled lecture halls, debates spilled into streets, protests began to whisper of change. Paris was not static, but always moving, always shifting, always alive, and still. In the quiet apartments above the noise, heroin remained. It was not celebrated, not public, but it was there, a thread woven through the city's private spaces. In the hush of night, after the laughter faded, after the music ended, it offered a silence, a slowing, a pause. It did not define Paris, but it belonged to its shadows, to its sighs, to its endless song of light and dark. As the 1950s closed, Paris stood on the threshold of yet another transformation. The decade had been one of rebuilding, of rediscovery, of optimism. The scars of the past had not disappeared, but they had softened, hidden beneath new layers of life. The cafés were full, the theaters alive, the parks vibrant, the Seine steady. The city had endured, as it always had, as it always would, and heroin, too, had endured. Not loud, not central, but present. From the wild nights of the 1920s to the hush of the 1940s, from the rebuilding of the 1940s to the optimism of the 1950s, it had remained, always discreet, always quiet, always a shadow moving alongside the light. It was not the heart of Paris, but it was one of its whispers, one of its sighs, one of its secrets kept behind closed shutters. The 1960s arrived in Paris with a mixture of optimism and restlessness. The city was alive, modernizing quickly, and filled with a new generation that had not known the war firsthand, but lived in its shadow. The boulevards grew busier with cars, the sidewalks more crowded with students, the cafés louder with conversations that stretched late into the night. Yet beneath the hum of daily life, Paris remained much the same as it had always been, a place of rhythm, of beauty, of endless conversations, of light that shifted gently from dawn to dusk. Mornings began with familiar patterns. Bakers opened their shops, arranging rows of golden baguettes in wooden baskets. The smell of butter from croissants drifted into the streets. Children in neat school uniforms hurried along sidewalks, their satchels bouncing against their sides. Buses rattled by, their windows fogged in the early chill. At the corner cafe, men in hats leaned over newspapers, the smoke from their cigarettes curling upward into the air, while the waiter moved briskly between tables, balancing cups of steaming coffee. Yet there was also something new in the air, something electric. The voices of the young were louder now, more certain, more determined to shape their own world. Students filled lecture halls by day, but by night they spilled into cafes, clubs, and streets. They spoke of philosophy, of politics, of freedom, of change. Their words flowed rapidly, layered over one another, eager, insistent, unafraid. In Saint-Germain, Des-Prés, the cafés that had once hosted Sartre and de Beauvoir, now filled with a younger crowd. Jazz was still there, but rock music had begun to drift across the Atlantic, its rhythms blending with local sounds, its energy embraced by a generation hungry for something new. Guitars appeared alongside saxophones, Drums rolled faster, the beat pulsed louder, the air seemed charged with possibility, with a sense that everything could shift, everything could expand. Heroin, too, remained in the city quiet, discreet, a private presence. For some, it was an escape from the intensity of the times. The debates, the protests, the rushing energy of youth could be overwhelming, and in small apartments above the boulevards, some sought silence in a familiar ritual. A young artist, exhausted after hours of painting in a studio with cold stone walls, might retreat into stillness with it. A musician, his ears ringing from the relentless rhythm of the club, might seek its soft quiet when the crowd dispersed. For them, it was not a banner waved in public, but a whisper carried in private, a way of slowing the world. Still, the city outside moved forward. In cinemas, the Nouvelle Vague was in full bloom. Directors like Godard and Truffaut were changing film itself. Their stories experimental, their style bold, their vision fresh. Young audiences flocked to see them, lining sidewalks, buzzing with discussion afterward in cafés. These films mirrored their lives, restless, questioning, eager to push boundaries. The glow of cinema screens flickered across faces in dark theaters, the light reflecting both the dreams and the questions of the time. In fashion, too, Paris reinvented itself. Designers introduced sleeker lines, shorter skirts, brighter colors. The city's streets became their runway, with youth adopting new styles that spoke of liberation and individuality. On a sunny afternoon, one might see young women walking along the boulevard Saint-Michel in dresses that swayed above the knee, their hair cut short, their movements quick and confident. Young men in slim suits and narrow ties leaned casually against café chairs, cigarettes in hand, their eyes alive with ideas. But alongside this brightness came moments of disquiet. The decade was one of protest and upheaval, and Paris, always a stage for voices, became filled with shouts, banners, and marching feet. By the middle of the 1960s, demonstrations became part of the city's rhythm. Students chanted for change, workers demanded better conditions, philosophers stood among them, amplifying their calls. Cobblestones that had once echoed only with the clatter of carriages now rang with the pounding of thousands of feet. For many Parisians, these protests were exhilarating, for others, unsettling. Yet even on such days, daily life continued. In the mornings, bakeries still sold bread. At noon, families gathered for meals. In the evenings, lovers still walked the riverbanks, the lamps glowing softly above them. Life in Paris never stopped, even as it shifted. In the quiet corners of this changing city, heroin lingered. It was not shouted in the streets, not debated in lecture halls, but it existed, as it always had. In some ways, it mirrored the times, a desire to step beyond the ordinary, to experience something different, to push past boundaries. For a handful of the restless and the weary alike, it offered a pause in the whirlwind. Imagine an attic studio in Montparnasse in 1966. The roof slopes low, the walls bare, the air filled with the smell of turpentine and canvas. Outside, the sounds of traffic drift upward, mingled with distant laughter from a nearby cafe. Inside, a young painter sits on a stool, his brush resting against his knee. His canvases lean unfinished against the wall, their colors half-formed, their shapes unresolved. On a table nearby rests a small vial, a quiet presence in the room. Later, as night falls and the city glows below, he will reach for it, seeking not chaos but stillness, a gentle slowing, a silence to carry him through until dawn. Meanwhile, the city below does not sleep. Nightclubs thrum with rhythm, students debate in smoke-filled rooms, couples dance beneath glittering lights. The Seine flows as it always has, reflecting the glow of bridges, carrying with it the murmurs of the city's endless voice. By 1968, the restlessness of the decade came to its peak. Paris erupted with protests, with barricades, with voices rising in unison. Students occupied universities, workers filled the streets. The city became alive with possibility and tension. Walls filled with graffiti, slogans painted in bold strokes of red and black. For weeks, Paris seemed to stand on the edge of transformation. And yet, even during these turbulent days, Paris remained itself. Market stalls opened in the mornings. Cafés brewed coffee. The smell of fresh bread filled the air. Families strolled through parks on Sundays. The Seine flowed calmly beneath its bridges. Amid the chants and the shouts, life continued, steady and resilient. For those in the quiet shadows, heroin remained a constant. It did not vanish during the noise of protest. It simply withdrew into the corners. In private apartments, behind closed shutters, some turned to it as a way of shutting out the intensity of the times. For them, it was not about change, not about revolution, but about silence. A moment of calm in a city that roared. As the 1960s drew to a close, Paris stood changed. The decade had reshaped its culture, its voices, its rhythms. The youth had spoken, loudly and clearly, and their words echoed through universities, theaters, and streets. Cinema, fashion, art, music, all had shifted, all had expanded. The city was vibrant, restless, alive. But amid this energy, the quiet shadow of heroin endured. From the roaring clubs to the silent attics, from the laughter of cafés to the whispers of private rooms, it remained, not the story of Paris, but one of its many stories. Not the defining note, but a low hum beneath the music, steady, discreet, continuous. As the Seine reflected the lights of the city at the decade's end, Paris prepared to step into yet another chapter. The 1970s loomed ahead, with promises and uncertainties, with new voices and new silences, and as always, Paris would carry all of it: the light, the sound, the whispers, the shadows in its endless, unbroken rhythm. The 1970s settled over Paris like a mist, soft and uneven, filled with both light and shadow. The city had changed once more. The echoes of the 1960s, the protests, the slogans, the restless energy of youth, still lingered in the air, but the streets seemed calmer now, as if exhaling after a storm. The Seine flowed as it always had, indifferent to decades, carrying reflections of bridges and lamps across its surface. Mornings in Paris began with familiar patterns that had endured through centuries. The smell of fresh bread drifted out of boulangeries, filling narrow streets with warmth. Children skipped to school with satchels on their backs, their laughter rising into the crisp morning air. Women arranged flowers in shop windows, splashes of color against the pale stone walls. Street sweepers moved slowly along the boulevards, brushing away the remnants of the previous night. Yet the city also bore new textures, signs of a world moving forward. Neon lights glowed more brightly above certain shops. Fashion had shifted again, colors bold, patterns striking, lines. Young people walked with headphones slung over their shoulders, carrying cassette players that offered a private rhythm to accompany the city's sounds. Cafés filled with new discussions, sometimes lighter, sometimes more cynical. Always alive, heroin, still, remained in the shadows. It did not dominate headlines, it did not roar in the streets, but it existed quietly, tucked into corners of the city's rhythm. For some, it was an echo of earlier decades, a habit picked up in the 1950s or 60s, carried into the present with a certain inevitability. For others, it was something newly encountered, whispered about in dim corners of nightclubs or quiet apartments. Always, it was discreet, hidden behind shutters, carried out in silence rather than spectacle. Artists continued to climb steep staircases to their studios, canvases tucked under arms, brushes wrapped in cloth. Their rooms smelled of paint and turpentine. Their windows looked out over rooftops and chimneys. They worked in solitude by day, but at night, some sought release in quiet rituals that had become as much a part of their routine as mixing colors or stretching canvas. For them, heroin was less a rebellion than a pause, a slowing of the pulse, a way to retreat into stillness. Down in Saint-Germain, the cafés remained full, though the music had changed. Jazz still played in some corners, but elsewhere the sounds of rock, funk, and emerging electronic tones drifted into the night air. Students leaned over tables, still talking of philosophy and politics, but also of cinema, music, and the shifting world beyond France. Their words rose into smoke-filled rooms, blending with the clatter of cups and the hum of voices. On the weekends, the markets thrived. Stalls brimmed with vegetables, cheeses, and cuts of meat. Vendors called out prices, their voices mingling with the chatter of shoppers. Families strolled together, children tugging at their parents' hands, pointing to pastries or sweets. The rhythm of daily life was steady, ordinary, comforting. For most Parisians, heroin was far away, existing only as rumor or a hushed story, not part of their lives. The city's true heartbeat was still its bread, its markets, its cafés, its people moving steadily through time. And yet, in certain circles, heroin had become more visible. Musicians whispered of it in backstage rooms, their instruments resting silently nearby. Writers mentioned it in diaries, tucked away between lines of poetry or prose. Painters, dancers, actors, some brushed against it, some embraced it, some simply watched from a distance. But always it was spoken of in quiet tones, rarely loud, rarely public. The government began to take notice, slowly, cautiously. Reports were written, policies discussed. But in the 1970s, the shadow still seemed smaller than it would become later. For now, heroin remained in the margins, in the half-light carried along quietly as the city's other stories unfolded more brightly. In the evenings, Paris glowed. Street lamps lit the boulevards, their reflections shimmering on the wet pavement after a rain. Lovers walked hand in hand along the riverbanks, their footsteps soft against the stones. Friends gathered in apartments, laughter echoing down hallways. In the theaters, audiences watched new films, the screen flickering across rows of faces. In restaurants, waiters carried trays of steaming dishes to waiting tables. The city was alive with warmth, with sound, with light. And always, the Seine flowed. Boats drifted slowly across its surface, carrying tourists, workers, dreamers. Its waters reflected the city's endless rhythm, the lights of bridges, the silhouettes of towers. Generations had stood at its edge, watching, listening, dreaming. It held within it all the stories, the joy, the sorrow, the whispers, the songs carrying them gently toward the sea. As the 1970s drew on, Paris seemed older and younger all at once. The new decade had brought with it both change and continuity. Technology advanced, culture shifted, yet the familiar rhythms endured. Heroin, too, endured, not loudly, not centrally, but as one of many undercurrents in the life of the city. For those who encountered it, it was personal, private, hidden away. For the rest of the city, it remained unseen, unspoken, another shadow in a city of countless shadows. And so Paris carried on, through mornings filled with bread and coffee, through afternoons bustling with traffic and talk, through evenings glowing with lamps and laughter, through nights softened by the river's reflection. It carried all its voices, all its silences, all its stories, the light and the shadow, the song and the whisper, the bright and the dim. If you walk the streets of Paris at night, even now, you may feel it, the layers of time resting one upon another, the footsteps of generations echoing faintly beneath your own. You may sense the laughter of cafés from a century ago, the music of long-closed clubs, the brushstrokes of forgotten painters, and somewhere in those layers lies the quiet story of heroin in Paris, not loud, not central, but present, a thread woven softly into the fabric of the city. The story does not end, not truly. Paris continues, as it always has, carrying forward with its bread and its lights, its cafés and its conversations, its shadows and its brilliance. The Seine still flows, bridges still stretch across its surface, lamps still glow in the night. The city remains timeless, infinite, always awake, always dreaming. And as you listen, perhaps with your eyes growing heavier, you may let this city drift gently into your own dreams, a Paris of calm streets, of quiet voices, of soft light, where every story, even the darkest ones, becomes gentle in the endless rhythm of time.